name is Rabab Ghazzoul and I came to Cardiff in 1993. I'm Iraqi. I'm a mixture of Iraqi, kind of Armenian and also American. But Iraqi, I sort of considered myself, I suppose, in terms of my roots, Iraqi. I was born in Mosul, which is probably the northernmost kind of one of the major cities, northernmost cities in Iraq, in 1970, which makes me 43. Well, actually, funnily enough, the very first memory I can ever recall is what I later realised was being in Beirut, because my aunt and uncle lived in Lebanon for a long time. My other aunt and uncle were in Egypt, so we must have gone to visit them when we were young. So I remember being very small. I was in a pram, so I could have been maybe 1.5, I don't know. And I remember being in a kind of apartment where my aunt lived, looking out, I suppose I don't remember the city, but I knew it was high up. And must have been my cousins who were older than me and my brother kind of were playing around me. That's my first memory. And when I ran it by my parents later on, they said, oh yeah, that must have been in Lebanon. So we were, of course, living in Iraq at the time, but we would have been visiting relatives. And I suppose when I was growing up, my memories are really of just, living in Mosul. I was there on and off till I was about 10. So the house we lived in, and the life we had there, which it was very much based around family and very much based around extended family, and friends and relatives and neighbours. And I suppose I have lots of memories of particular things that we did, the city, the school I went to. I can probably tell you more about that. But well, you just, I suppose, grew up with a very deeply ingrained sense of respect for your elders. That went without saying. I don't know if I was ever overtly taught, or sat down and told, but I think it's just so strongly is so strongly in the culture I was sort of brought up in, that you constantly show respect and take care of your elders, but that didn't just mean your kind of familial elders. It meant your teachers, anyone who's mentored you or taught you. I suppose certainly I remember in Iraq this sense of you have a debt of gratitude to those people. They are the people that shape you. They're the people that enable you to become the person you are. So there's this really deeply ingrained respect for our teachers and, of course, parents and grandparents. So, I suppose that would come out when I was a child in the kind of things that would just automatically happen. So there would be big, socializing was very much around food, big family, extended family gatherings, and of course lots of friends, a lot of food, always being cooked. And those parties or haflas, everyone would be there, right across, from the oldest to the kind of little babies. And I remember every single time those kinds of social gatherings would happen, the kids would have to go around, and sometimes this would take an hour, could be an hour plus, literally going around every single family member, guest, person there. One having to say hello and kind of be hugged and just have you all the time. I used to dread it because your cheeks would be squeezed really hard, and this would happen across quite a number of people. People would always sit in a huge circle. You would literally have to make your way round. Of course, as a child, you'd get a bit fed up, but it was just standard what you had to do. And then very often, before you got a chance to go and play, you would have to go around with the cheddars, which is like the nuts, the seeds, the pistachios, the whatever, and you'd just do that, and go around for quite a long time serving everyone, and I totally wasn't conscious of it at that time, but I remember, now I look back, it was always about, as a child, you're there, not necessarily to serve, but to really understand that, you know, to have, those were the ways of kind of showing respect to older people, and ways of learning how to be hospitable, which I think is deeply ingrained in a lot of cultures, but certainly something I very much associate with the culture of growing up in the Middle East. You know, how to take care of people and be hospitable was something we learned at a young age, and putting others first, you know. Well, I was originally 2, because my father came to study. He did his doctorate in Manchester University. So we were here for 3 years while he was getting his PhD. And then we went back to Iraq when I was 5. And I suppose the rest of the time, up until 10, I was in Iraq. Probably with occasional trips back to England, because I came to England first when I was 2. And my dad... Yeah, so the last time I was in Iraq was when I was 10, actually. And I've asked my dad about this, actually, kind of in later years, and I think it was a combination of things that were happening at the time in terms of our family. I think Saddam came into power in around 79, and my dad was teaching at the university in Mosul then, and kind of, I suppose, probably like, I don't know, in the former Soviet Union, people would be expected to join the Communist Party. There was an expectation, especially amongst, you know, any kind of professionals, that people would join the Ba'ath Party, which my father was asked to do in his, I suppose, context of his work, the academic institution, and he didn't want to do that. He refused to do that, and I think he realised at that point, whilst it might not be a problem then, it was going to be a problem later on. My father's just a deeply principled person, but also deeply kind of inscribed with a sense of intolerance for abuse of authority of any kind. It's kind of something I've really learnt from him, and so I think he had a very strong sense of where things were going under this new leadership, and that this was going to be problematic. Certainly, if you opposed it, it was going to be problematic. And he was fortunate in that he'd done some teaching at the university where he studied, in England, in Manchester. So I think at the time we just went back temporarily. He was going to do some teaching, but then the war broke out in 1980 with Iran, and that changed everything, because that war went on for 8 years, and as those years went on, I think it became more and more apparent. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but would have become more apparent to my parents that we probably weren't going back. It was very unsafe to go back. Not so much getting back into Iraq, but you would not be able to come out. And that meant that my brother, who was 3 years older than me, probably at some point would have gone, if not conscripted, he would have kind of gone into this youth army training that everyone, you know, kids his age would have to kind of, and eventually, you know, for that war, as it went on, he probably would have been conscripted. So I think my parents realised, and, you know, at some point we settled in Britain. We were able to do that and got residency to live here. Well, I was in England then for sort of 9 years from the age of 10, and I then got interested as a teenager in theatre, and at school, not that the school I went to massively encouraged kind of the arts, but I got into theatre and I got into acting, and so I kind of came to do a drama degree in Aberystwyth University in '89, and I was there for 3 years. And after that, I kind of took a year out, and then actually ended up setting up a theatre company with people I was at college with, and kind of when we were sort of trying to figure out where to go, we kind of were thinking of a number of options, but it was a bit like putting a tail in the donkey, you know, pin in the, because it actually there were no obvious places. We couldn't really figure out why here and why not there. And actually in the end, I think we had a few contacts in Cardiff from having been in college in Wales, and there was a really big theatre festival going on that summer when we were about to kind of try and set up as a theatre company, a fledgling, you know, very kind of small, modest theatre company. There was a big international theatre festival for women. We happened to be all women setting this company up in Cardiff, and we thought we'll go and check that out, and then we thought, well, let's stay in Cardiff. And, you know, that's 20 years ago now, and I ended up settling here myself. No, I don't think so, because I'd sort of been in Britain permanently since 10, and of course younger than that. So I'd sort of grown up in kind of both cultures really, and so I don't think anything about, I'm trying to think. No, I don't think anything necessarily shocks me about Cardiff. I think probably going to Wales initially as a 19-year-old, only in retrospect did I realise and was I aware of how kind of naive I was around Welsh culture and the Welsh language, actually. I sort of rocked up at 19 in Aberystwyth, quite unaware that this is a bilingual country and that, and of course a lot of the kind of political underpinnings, around that. Only later did I start to become aware of, slightly, I suppose, the kind of cultural and political underpinnings of Wales and the experience of colonialism and the kind of, the historical struggle for kind of independence, cultural independence, the right to speak one's language. So I suppose, whilst there wasn't anything necessarily shocking, as I continued living in Cardiff, in Wales, I started to really get a measure of where I was. And some of those things resonated for me as a kind of country, as a small nation that had kind of been defined and experienced by colonialism. Those things resonated in terms of, I suppose, some of the things that the country I came from was going through, had historically been through in terms of its colonial history, but certainly was at the time I came to Wales. In 91, I was at college, and that's when the Gulf War started. So I remember watching those first kind of bombs of that completely crazy war raining down on Baghdad when I was like 21 with my college school. No, they hadn't. And they were, of course, my dad is probably, very typically Iraqi in one sense, whatever that is. I don't really know what that is. We can make generalizations, but very untypically in the other. So, the kind of expectations that might be not imposed, but expectations of his children and what they ought to do. My dad was always he's a pretty philosophical man. He kind of really felt what was really important is for us to kind of do, what we felt passionate about. Which didn't necessarily go down well with like other members of the family. Like I remember my uncle, who's much more traditional, was like shocked that my dad thought it was okay for my brother to go and study, it would have been biology or he's now an ecologist. This was just, and he's sort of very established in his field. However, this wasn't, it wasn't medicine and it wasn't law. So that it was, I kind of clocked that about my dad. For me to have expressed going into the arts was, of course, even more way off any kind of more conventional route that might be expected of me. But my parents have always been real believers in really doing what we feel passionately about, and one of the things I really appreciate about them. Well, it's kind of changed really and kind of shifted, as I think a lot of people working in the arts kind of have experience of, because first of all, I started out in theatre. So I sort of thought when I was younger I wanted to act, but actually pretty soon when I was at college I realised I needed to find ways of expressing these ideas in my head, these ideas of how to make theatre, these ideas of how to work with text and create performances, and I was really influenced by a lot of stuff I was seeing at the time, quite experimental dance and movement and performance work, and that whole world of contemporary theatre opened up to me. So by the time I left college, I'd done a little bit of training around theatre direction. And actually when we set up the theatre company, I was sort of co-artistic director of this company, so myself and one of the other people I was working with, we directed these shows, and it was, I suppose, 8 or so years of directing kind of experimental, kind of contemporary performance, and kind of learning how to do that, through trial and error, and trying to, I suppose, develop my creative sensibilities and my kind of artistic vision. However, my work in theatre tended to be very visual, a lot of interest in the visual, in space, often in sculptural elements, in installation, and kind of as I went on, it became more and more apparent that was what I was interested in. And so at a certain point, I ended up having a bit of a break and making more solo work. And then the first solo piece I made was probably the only solo kind of work I made as a performer, if you like, was me making performance work, but it was kind of in a site-specific kind of space. The work responded very much to the space. There was lots of elements of installation, very visual. And what I realised, I suppose, as I went on, is I feel like I'm a visual artist more than I am a theatre maker, and the kind of theatre gradually fell away. And I started making, I suppose, looking back, what was more and more visual arts-based work. And then I kind of figured, really, at some point, I realised I probably should have gone to art college instead of gone and studied theatre. But I did go to art college as a kind of in my mid-30s, mid to late 30s. So, and that was great, and studied fine art, but was already kind of, I suppose, working as a visual artist. And so I've done that really for the last probably 13, 14 years. So my kind of my creative practice has shifted. And even now my kind of creative practice as a visual artist is kind of very diverse. So people say, oh, what media do you work in? Do you paint? Do you draw? Do you take photographs? And actually it really shifts depending. I suppose I'm not working with the fine arts. I'm not a painter. I'm not sculpting, drawing, but I work a lot with people. So a lot of my work, whether it's working with film and video, or whether it's working with kind of what I call public encounter, often I'm working with sort of a lot of research and process-based projects, very much involved in people, which get documented and get explored, and the eventual outcome might be a piece of film work, or it might be an installation of some kind, but it's very much involved in, my interest is in people and the social. So I suppose I kind of work with what's now termed socially engaged practice, that it's out of these interactions with people that's the medium of your work, really. Well, I suppose historically when I started, when we set up the theatre company, we started making work, and of course had to kind of develop some kind of track record, but eventually we started getting small amounts of Arts Council funding, which was great, so we could do a little bit more. And then when that finished, I suppose I started making work as an artist, and although it didn't happen immediately, at some point I started getting funded sort of by the Arts Council, and from time to time that's happened. So a lot of the times I've been able to take time out to kind of make my work and develop my work has been through those sources of funding. And I suppose over the years I'm trying to think, I kind of applied for other bits and pieces of support and funding support, and like everyone else, as an artist and a kind of freelance arts practitioner, if you like, you're kind of getting involved in applying for all kinds of different opportunities as and when they come up. Some of those are regular posts, that you apply for like everyone else. Others are kind of residencies. Others are funding opportunities for you to kind of develop an exhibition or make a particular piece of work or research. So I've kind of, on the whole, that's been from Wales, but there's often been other opportunities from outside of Wales that I've been able to take advantage of. Well, I think I was really fortunate when we set up the theatre company, because I had to really learn, like, on the job. I got an internship with a organisation called the Magdalena Project, which is a women's kind of international theatre network, really. And I kind of really learned through doing that, and through simply trying to make a theatre company work. So I didn't know anything about how to fill a funding application, how to market your work, how to write copy for a flyer, how to go and have a meeting with a theatre programmer, So I suppose for me, probably doing it, really learning through doing is probably one of the most important things. And I suppose, honing your skills that way, but I've also always really strongly believed in kind of learning, having mentors and learning from people. So I've kind of often, if not surrounded myself, I've often sought out people who I can learn from. I've gone this is a gap in kind of my skills or something I need to learn. Who has got this skill? Who's experienced or knowledgeable about this? How do I go and ask them and find out from them? So I think in that sense it's kind of strange. I don't think many artists ever kind of go, right, we've gone to college and learned how to be an artist, and now I'm in the position to fundraise for my work or promote my work. I don't, or know how to approach curators. I think it's a kind of learned thing through experience. But I'd say probably the most important thing is just continuing to make your work, which I think is really hard in really precarious, even more so now. The climate for the arts is more precarious than it's ever been. There's less funding, there's less opportunities. So really the challenge is just to maintain your creative practice, keep on making work. I think that's changed. And not changed in some ways. My own experience I suppose I even now I struggle to know how to define myself. I suppose a British Iraqi. I've grown up in both countries for the large part. From the age of 10 I've been in Britain, so of course culturally I'm British, but my roots are in Iraq. So I suppose to answer your question, I need to, I suppose, talk a little bit about that. So I kind of think when I was younger, especially in my teens and in my 20s, as an adult in my 20s, I was doing a lot of soul searching about, all the usual stuff when you're a product of different cultures, like who are you, what's your identity. I was witnessing the loss of my Arabic as well over the years, so I grew up bilingually. And then when you start to lose your language and you start to experience that the language of the country you've now adopted is becoming the primary one, and there's such a profound connection to our language in that it connects us to our culture. And I was losing that gradually because I wasn't speaking it. And I suppose I had a lot of questions in my 20s about that, and what does it mean to be, what is authentically Arab or, Iraqi? It's a kind of, there's no answer to it. It's a ridiculous question in a way. It's like, what is authentically human, or but at the time I think I had a lot of, if not insecurities, a sense of where do I fit, because whilst I had this Arab background and culture and roots, I didn't necessarily mix, especially as an adult when I came here, with Iraqi communities. Also, we grew up as, in the north of Iraq, there's a large kind of population of large Christian communities, and we grew up not as Muslims, but as Chaldean Christians, not necessarily practicing Christians, but so that sense of coming, let's say, to Britain and connecting with an Arab Muslim community wasn't something in my experience. So I kind of felt a little bit, where are my roots? Where are my kind of links? And I think I used to try and find ways of making links, but then they could be a little bit artificial sometimes. I felt the artifice of it. So I think I ended up making work about it. I ended up as an artist kind of making work about it, I suppose, as you do. And some of that work looked at issues of belonging and identity and dislocation from culture, and which dislocation from language and relationship to language and cultural fluency, because I remember at one point thinking, although I haven't studied British history in any depth other than at school, the kind of stuff you learn at school, I've got unconsciously a sense of who the British kings and queens, the kind of political leaders of however many centuries, not necessarily in any depth, but it's part of you as part of a kind of sort of unconscious cultural kind of knowledge that you have. And there was a point where I went, I don't know that about my Iraqi culture. It's because I haven't been there for long enough. I left when I was 10, and I realised actually if I had to go back, I'd have to go and study about it, but I wouldn't naturally have that unconscious awareness. And that's when I kind of realised, oh yeah, that's why I'm British, because but I think that issue is really I think it's very live for me. I think it's live for a lot of people that kind of have that experience of dislocation from their culture, of like, you kind of have, for me, you have this sort of private love affair with this part of you that doesn't necessarily always get an airing. It's a bit like having had an old relationship with someone, and you kind of, you always remember them, and even though you don't see them anymore, there's this really strong yearning, you know. So in terms of whether I work as an artist with different communities, there was a point in my practice as a visual artist where, I don't know, maybe 10 or so years ago, I was maybe making work that was exploring identity and was exploring my relationship to my roots a little bit, and then for a while I found myself being described, you know, maybe sometimes by galleries or, you know, people showing my work as Iraqi artist, and I kind of really started resisting that because I didn't know what that relevance had to my work, because my work wasn't solely about identity. And I think sometimes when you are, well, you know, I think we're all fundamentally culturally diverse, everyone, every single person on the planet, but when you're sort of more obviously culturally diverse or sort of a product of clearly two cultures or more cultures, I think sometimes as an artist you can become to see that can become your label, and I think I've really resisted that, because my work is more than just me being Iraqi, or it sometimes I have been interested in that, and other times I've been interested in a whole load of other things that are without a doubt informed by everything I've experienced, but are not, you know, definitively who I am or what my work's about. So I've kind of resisted more and more that I don't know if I'm comfortable being defined as an Iraqi or a British Iraqi artist, because I don't think that says everything about who I am and what my work is. It says something very partial. So in terms of communities I've ended up working with, I've not necessarily gone to seek out particular communities that are Arab or Iraqi or, you know, however, my work over the years has definitely put me in touch with a whole range of different communities, and that's because I've worked not just as an artist but as a freelancer. I've worked as a community development practitioner, so I've worked with a lot of minority communities across Wales, really, specifically South Wales, in that kind of work. I've worked a lot with women from minority ethnic backgrounds, so invariably, if not directly as an artist, within my arts and community work, I'm often working with communities. And actually, I think one of the things I experience a lot is when you come from a place that you, for various reasons, in this case war mainly, you haven't been able to go back to. For me, there's an experience of you don't quite belong there anymore, and whilst you belong here, there's a part of you that is to do with this other culture that never gets quite expressed. So you kind of feel like a floating, you're kind of floating. You're sort of, there's always something slightly peripheral. However totally part of this culture you are, your adopted home and are a product of it, there's a kind of slightly peripheral on the outside experience of it. And I've found, as I've got older, that's been an amazing entry point for me into a whole range of different communities and cultures, actually, because you kind of don't belong anywhere in a really strong sense. So that means it gives you a huge sense of movement and fluidity, and that's been the thing that whilst I suppose I think it caused me consternation when I was younger. Why don't I belong? I don't know where I fit. Now I kind of really love that about my experience. I kind of feel like I can move with great ease around anyone and any kind of community, and I enjoy that. Well, I suppose I wasn't particularly brought up religiously, although I was... So my very first experiences of religion were when I was at school in Iraq, because of course Iraq, you know, like many countries in the Middle East, it's primarily Muslim. I think maybe 7% of Christians in Iraq. Not anymore, sadly, because of the wars, and certainly this one, the most recent one, means that Christians really become very persecuted in Iraq, and there's practically no Christians left in the country, which is so sad for the kind of deeply diverse kind of history of Iraq. But anyway, some of my earliest memories of school in Iraq were going around on my own when they had religious studies classes, basically Quran classes, because for the handful of Christians, you always knew who the Christians were in school, because for those lessons there was no other provision, you know. So for the handful of Christians in school, you'd just have a free period, a free class. So you'd kind of roam the schools. It was like a really powerful experience when I remember there was a sense of freedom because you knew everyone was in classes. Normally it was very, very hot, so all the doors were wide open. You'd go down these corridors and you could see people in classes, and because your class happened to be, Quran studies at that point, you just got a free class. So I kind of, from quite a young age, had a real sense of being a bit of a loner, a bit of a, being sort of somehow outside whatever the kind of, whatever was going on. So that was very particular, that experience. And then, and we used to kind of roam the corridors, and then normally, because it was like a school, it went from 5 or 6 through to 18, huge school, and you'd be able to kind of see who the other people who were always kind of roaming around or just kind of hanging out on their own, really, waiting for that class to be over. As I grew up, although my parents weren't religious, we were Christian family, and I kind of went to church. Some of my aunts were or great aunts, were really religious people. So socially we'd go to church as I was growing up. And then when I came to England, I remember, which was about the age of 10, I remember as I continued to grow up, I had a very strong, didn't go to church, but had a strong sense of some kind of spiritual awareness, and I didn't know what it was. So I suppose at that age I just thought it was God, because that's all I had. So I had a very private, profound belief in God, in a kind of, I had a lot of problems when I was going to school in England, because I'd come recently from Iraq, so as I went into secondary school, I experienced a lot of bullying about being different. And so I kind of used this kind of, now that I look back, quite strange, very private, personal connection with God. I used to talk to God all the time. And when I got older, stopped believing in God, didn't make sense anymore, this spiritual connection was still there. And I think as I hit my early 20s, I was kind of trying to figure out, ask questions, all the usual, life, what is it, why am I so unhappy, what's going on, what's my connection to the wider world, what is the meaning of it all, why even be here? And those questions, I suppose, led me to eventually meet Buddhism, and I kind of started practicing Buddhism when I was about 23, 24, and that was about the first or second year I came to Cardiff. And that kind of is a huge, enormous influence on my life, really. I've been a practicing Buddhist for probably 19 years now. And that makes a lot of sense in terms of how I deal with daily life, and how I kind of make sense of the world, but also, I suppose, change the things that really profoundly cause us to suffer. And some of those things are maybe personal to me, and some of those are the basic universal things, about being alive. So that's my, I suppose, faith or spiritual practice. Probably being with these 3 other people that I was setting up this theatre company with, and some of my earliest memories were the training I did here. So I was kind of suddenly in a city where, as a young person exposed to the arts, wanting to learn about the arts. So some of my earliest memories are going and volunteering and doing training with different theatre practitioners. That there was an organisation called the Centre for Performance Research. They brought over the most diverse range of practitioners from all over the world. It was extraordinary, actually. And going to kind of workshops with those kind of organisations, sitting in chapter, which is where we had our little theatre office, and rehearsing in Chapter Arts Centre for these shows that we were trying to make, on next to, often no money. So some of my earliest memories of Cardiff are kind of trying to become an artist, trying to make work. But I suppose also, the kind of huge diversity in Cardiff. I'd kind of lived in Cathays, and then I came over to Riverside in 97, and what I kind of felt, really stood out for me was just the huge amount of mix of different communities, of different people within an incredibly small city. Actually, within a very compact city, you'd go from Riverside to Grangetown to the docks to over the river and over the other side, and very quickly. The geographical landscape shifted quite quickly and communities shifted, but this huge, real kind of mix of people. And the thing I probably remember the most is just how incredibly warm and friendly people were here. I feel that about Wales. I don't know if I can make that generalisation, but Cardiff felt like a really beautifully warm, friendly place, full of heart. I think that's why I stay here. I love the heart, here. Well, I mean, my feelings about that are that, arts organisations and struggle always to address anything other than the things that are straightforward, which is their mainstream audiences. And I suppose I feel very strongly that if we're to really kind of create a culture that is as accessible, as possible to everyone, that projects are really, and that policies and access and inclusion and all of those kind of policies, I suppose, are fundamentally mainstreamed into the very fabric of what an organisation does. I think part of developing wider audiences or kind of creating access or whatever those kind of buzz phrases are, has been sometimes about creating bespoke projects that specifically go, oh great, this is for the Somali community, or this is for the Yemeni community, or this is for the Asian kind of population, or and that's great, but it means that we constantly make tailored projects for particular communities and they never actually become part of our mainstream audiences or participants. And I think the most important thing organisations can do is to kind of really think through clearly and strategically, how do they mainstream their practice, how do they mainstream everything that they do, so that kind of diversity is at the roots, really, is at the absolute foundations of how they're working and practicing and relating and reaching out to people, really.